This morning we are looking at Romans chapter 14, and Norman gave you some hope that we might get into chapter 15. And the reason for that is this really is one integrated section. You'll notice that chapter 14 begins, "As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions." He contrasts people that he describes as weak in faith and then those who are strong. And in chapter 15, verse 1, "We who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak." So he's still talking about the weak and the strong as we get into chapter 15. How far this section goes would be a matter of dispute. I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference where one section ends and another begins. I tend to think myself it goes all the way down through verse 13. To provide the bookends to the discussion of the strong and the weak. And if possible, I do want to take all of that in today. The two positions that are described, strong and weak, some preface on that may be helpful. I don't think Paul is wanting to suggest that one type of Christian is inferior to another. I don't think he's talking about people that we might, we use the term, he's a very strong Christian. We mean by that that person is committed to Christ, outspoken about his commitment to Christ, willing to take stands for that position of Christ and so on. Paul's not talking about that. He's talking about people who have different understandings of the gospel with respect to two issues in particular, though it wouldn't necessarily be limited to two positions. He's really talking about people, a contrast between people that you might say are more orthodox in the sense that they have a better grasp of the gospel and what it demands of people today, over against people who have a less well-developed sense of the gospel and what it demands today. He's not suggesting that the weak are not Christians. He's going to tell us that we are to accept those who are weak in faith. But it's a matter of difference of convictions over two issues in particular, but they are not positions that Paul describes as utterly indifferent to one another. Sometimes theologians will refer to this chapter as adiaphora. That's a Latin term describing things that are indifferent. In other words, it doesn't matter one way or another. Paul doesn't really take that position. It's not that they don't matter one way or another. One position is strong and the other position is weak. One position has a better understanding of the gospel than the other does. But those who are strong, those who have a better understanding, are not to despise or look down their nose upon those who are weak. They are to accept them, they are to welcome them, and in fact, he's going to call them to serve them in particular ways where they might give up their own convictions in order to conduct themselves in a manner more consistent with the one who is weak in faith without compromising his own positions on it, but to serve that person so as not to encourage them toward doing what they themselves believe to be sinful. Now, Paul's position on this is subtle. He's talking about people who believe that doing something is sinful when it's not. They're mistaken about that. Okay? So were they to do it, they wouldn't actually have sinned. However, given the fact that they believe it to be sin, if they go ahead and do it, then they have sinned. Whatever is not of faith is of sin. So if you believe it to be wrong and you go ahead and do it, even if you were wrong about that, you have done wrong in doing what you believe to be wrong. You with me? All right, who's on first? All right. It's a subtle issue that's going on here. There is one position that is more right than the other. But the fact that the people have differences on this, and the fact that the people that Paul describes as weak have not yet been persuaded of the position Paul would consider to be the better one, the stronger one, the more in line with the gospel and the teaching of the Holy Scriptures, the fact that they haven't been able to embrace that doesn't mean that they are to be despised, that they're to be ridiculed, etc. Let me give you the story of this from my main theological mentor in life, Dr. John Gerstner. He had been invited to teach out west for one of the parachurch groups. I think it was Campus Crusade at the time, but he used to teach for a number of them. But I think this was a crusade story. And he was teaching a group of young staff members, and they would come in each morning, and he would brutalize them all day long with his teaching. Anyway, Dr. Gerstner walked in one morning, 4 or 5 days into the class, and there was kind of a low vibration of kind of giggling in the class going on. He didn't pay much attention to it. He was ready to launch into his day's work and so on. And before he got started, even before he could open in prayer, one of the students said, "Dr. Gerstner." I said, "Yes." He said, "Did you notice anything different in the class today?" He said, "No, looks like my same class." "Do you notice anything different about," and I don't remember the young lady's name, let's call her Deborah. "Do you notice anything different about Deborah?" "No, I don't, actually." "Well, don't you think she looks nice today?" "Well, yeah, she looks nice today. I think Deborah looks nice every day." And so on. Well, Deborah is not looking up. She has not met his eyes. Her head is down, and you can tell that she's ashamed, and in fact, rather emotionally disturbed at the matter. All right, so she's got her head down. She won't look up. "But don't you think Deborah looks nice today?" "Yes, I do." He said, "Well, tell me what is different about Deborah today." "Today's the first day she wore makeup." Deborah had come from a family and probably a church tradition that believed it was sinful to put on makeup, and she had never done it. During the course of the week out there, being mixed with other young Campus Crusade people from various campuses and so on, they had ridiculed Deborah. You might say they had bullied Deborah. They had made fun of her for not doing this. And finally, to fit in, go along, get everybody off her back, they painted her up. What else she called it? So they had Deborah made up. And they were rather proud of their handiwork. But Deborah was ashamed. Deborah had gone along with it just to fit in, I guess. Just to kind of stop the bullying. Well, I just have to say that class picked the wrong professor. Because Dr. Gerstner proceeded to lay into them on the basis of principles that can be found in Romans chapter 14. He happened to believe with the majority of the class that there was nothing sinful about makeup in and of itself. Of course, it can go to extremes. It can violate the norms of aesthetics in certain extremes. That's not the issue. The question is, does the Bible forbid a woman to put on makeup? And his position was no, the Bible does not forbid a woman to put on makeup. But so long as Deborah believed the Bible did not permit a woman to put on makeup, the duty and obligation of her class members was to support her in her conviction until she came to be better instructed in the matter. But to support her in love, to do what she believed to be the right thing to do. They didn't have to sacrifice their own convictions in the matter. They just needed to love her, to accept her as she was, to support her in the conviction because she was doing it for the Lord Jesus Christ. They could have easily sat down and had a conversation about it. Well, did the Bible actually say this? What would be the basis for this in the Bible? You can have a discussion. You can try to talk her out of the position so long as you're not bullying her. So long as you're not pressuring her to do what she herself believes to be a sinful thing. But that's what they had done. And Dr. Gerstner made it plain to them that they were the ones who were sinning, and quite grievously in the matter, though he agreed with them that Deborah had done nothing sinful in itself with respect to the makeup. But Deborah had done something sinful in that she had given in to the pressures of others to do what she herself believed was contrary to the commandment of Christ. And though she was wrong about whether it was a commandment of Christ, so long as she believed it was a commandment of Christ, she needed to stand by it. That's what's going on here in Romans chapter 14. The two issues are what you can eat and what days are to be honored as holy days. Now, if we took chapter 14 just by itself, forgetting chapter 15, and you had nothing else to go on, it may not be clear just who the groups were in this matter. It'd be easy to guess in the first century, but you wouldn't know just from what is found in chapter 14. But in chapter 15, and in the broader context of the whole letter, it's quite clear this is another of the problems between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. The issue about the days will turn out to be an issue about the Jewish holy days, and whether those days must be kept according to the regulations of the Old Testament. That would include the Jewish Sabbath, Saturday. Was that to be observed as a Sabbath day? It would also include all the other Sabbath days that come as a part of the other festivals that were to be honored, celebrated, observed in the course of a year's time. So those are the holy days that are at stake. Then there's the issue of the one who says you eat vegetables only. All right, that's a bit of a challenge because the Old Testament doesn't require you to eat vegetables only. There is, when I think I've explained this before, there's what I call Danielic vegetarianism. That's the vegetarianism of Daniel. Daniel adopted vegetarianism as an exile when he was taken to Babylon because although it was proper for him to eat meat as such, he couldn't eat meat unless it were killed in a kosher way. There were certain meats he couldn't eat, but they would have had plenty of beef in Babylon, but they wouldn't have had beef killed in a kosher manner. And so Daniel and his three friends, rather than violate their consciences, and in their case, violate the law of God, as clearly stated, they chose to eat vegetables only. Okay, there's no way to kill a vegetable in a kosher way. So they opted for vegetarianism. And it appears that's probably the issue for the Jewish Christians in Rome. Now, there's one scholar by the name of Bruce Winter, if you want to try to follow this out, though I just have to tell you, he doesn't write at a popular level. All right? This is a scholarly work, so if you get into it, you may think you've gotten into something that's just about as dry as it can be. But it has a lot of information about Roman law, Roman society, and this, that, and the other. But he argues that at the time of the decree of Claudius, and we know of this because Paul met Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth because they had been expelled from Rome over the decree of Claudius. And we know about the decree of Claudius from other Roman historians on it, but Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome in the late AD 40, say AD 49, and that was over what the Roman historian said was their constant uprisings over somebody by the name of Chrestus, which seems to be Christ. Winter argues that in conjunction with the decree of Claudius, who was expelling not Jewish Christians, just all Jews over their probably battles back and forth with Jewish Christians, that at the time the Jews were expelled, it also included making illegal Jewish businesses. All right, so it would have meant not only that the Jews are kicked out of Rome, but all the Jewish delicatessens are shut down. All right, the bagel industry just falls to pieces during that time. There's no kosher meats. There's nothing, okay? You can't get lox, and so on. So it becomes a banned, not just religion, but a banned culture in society. And that although the Jews are able to get back, I mean, Claudius dies and enforcement falls away and that kind of thing, although that goes back, the Jewish economy in Rome doesn't recover. And so where there had formerly been, the opportunity for Jews in Rome to buy kosher meats, etc., that opportunity is not there in abundance. In which case, if there are no kosher meats, then your option is vegetarianism, okay? Stir-fry vegetables, rice, be careful the sauce you use and so on. But that would have forced them, you see, into this. And those who were zealous for the law, for its holidays, for its food regulations, etc., they would have said that the moral, proper thing to do is to eat vegetables only. Now, Paul's position is they're wrong about that. The Bible doesn't require that. All right? Those laws, just like the laws of animal sacrifice and other things, belong to a ceremonial law in Israel that has now passed away with the coming of Jesus Christ. So Paul thinks it's proper for a Jewish Christian to eat barbecue of whatever sauce you prefer. It's proper. It's okay. That is part of the freedom that has come to us in Jesus Christ. It's okay to eat shrimp and grits. It's okay to eat lobster. It's okay to eat shellfish of all sorts because the requirements of the Jewish ceremonial law are gone. So when Paul's position is, eat barbecue to your heart's content. But if there are people in your church who still believe it's a sinful thing to eat barbecue, it is your duty and obligation to support them in their conviction. Not necessarily to adopt their conviction, but to support them in their conviction so that you're not bullying them or pressuring them to do what they believe is sinful. Okay? You hold your own opinion. You live consistently with your own opinion, but you live in love toward them, supporting them in their position and in their conviction. Now, issues about, whether we observe the dietary laws of the Jews, that's long gone from us. Issues about whether we are obligated to observe Jewish holy days, the Passover, the Jewish Sabbath, and so on, that's all gone for us. So we may not hear this chapter as challenging as we should, because the issues that are at stake here are no longer living issues for us. It seems, belonging to an altogether different world. But my friends, we've had many similar issues and still have them to this day. Think about the issue of alcohol among Christians. When I came to the church, I was the first hire after Dr. Glenn Connect. Now, Glenn believed that it was the duty and obligation of a church officer to abstain. And he asked me if I was willing to abide by that. It was not my conviction that the Bible taught that drinking alcohol was a sin. I didn't believe that, and I couldn't teach that. Could I abide by a principle of abstinence? Absolutely. Were there many practical reasons that could be offered to support that, and so on? Absolutely. I had a friend who held my position. He didn't believe it was wrong to drink alcohol, but he wasn't an elder in the church, and so when he was outside his home, if he was driving a car, he would never drink alcohol. Okay? And he was a big guy. He could have held a lot if he wanted, per body mass and all that kind of thing. But it was his conviction that were he to go to a party and without any fault on his own become involved in a traffic accident, and alcohol be smelled on his breath, okay, it was possible that he would bring the Church of Jesus Christ into scandal. That here is an elder of the church who has been caught driving under the influence, even though he may have been fully capable of operating the automobile safely, given his body mass and whatnot. But it would be easy enough to be over what was defined as the legal limit, or just to be brought under suspicion of it, to be required to take a breathalyzer. Even if you pass, okay, if it gets out in the news, that, so-and-so was involved in an accident, and he was breathalyzed, and so on. That's all people need to know. They will immediately conclude you didn't pass, and so on. So, for the sake of the honor of the Church of Jesus Christ, he abstained, even though he did not believe it was his moral obligation to abstain, so far as the alcohol itself was concerned, for the sake of Jesus Christ. But Paul is talking mainly about the impact that you would have upon people in your immediate fellowship and circle. That you would conduct yourself in a manner so as not to pressure them to do what they believe to be wrong. He wasn't saying that you were to adopt the convictions of the weaker brother. It's actually your duty and obligation to maintain your convictions as they are until you become convinced they're wrong. So it would be a sinful thing for you in your own study of the Bible and come to the conclusion that you believed it was okay to drink alcohol. It would be wrong for you to adopt the conviction of somebody who believed that it was okay. So your conduct is to be governed by your convictions, but also by your love for the weaker brother who is next to you. Okay? You can adopt his practice without adopting his convictions. You can conduct yourself in a manner that doesn't shame him or put him in a bad light with others. You can conduct yourself in a manner of love towards them without abandoning your own convictions. You can be upfront and open about your convictions. Okay, you're talking about meat offered to idols, and you're talking, I think, mainly about the issue of where you eat meat offered to idols. The Corinthians had problems in that the meat industry in Corinth was intimately tied with idolatry. So that virtually all the meat that you bought in the Corinthian meat market had some connection to idolatry. In fact, archaeologists actually discovered a sign for a butcher shop outside an ancient temple in Corinth. All right? So people go out, the people go out hunt, they bring back the meat to town. It's sanctified by the Corinthian idol, the way we would pass it through the American Dairy Association or something like that. They would offer it to their idol, and then meat's being sold out the back end of the temple. To have that, Paul said, look, go to the meat market, buy whatever you want, and eat whatever you want. But you can't go into the idol's temple to eat that meat, all right? Not only did they have butcher shops, they had restaurants and cafes connected to their temples and so on. And Paul says that's taking you a little bit closer. All right? That's putting you right into the place where it seems that idol worship is a part of what's going on, and you can't be a part of idol worship. So Paul says, go to the meat market, buy what you want. But if somebody says to you, this meat is offered to idols, and that person happens to be a weaker brother who believes that buying that meat is a sinful thing, and Paul's saying, for the sake of your weaker brother, you might just pass on and go down to the vegetable stand and leave it alone, so that you are not taking your weaker brother into a position where he is influenced to do what he himself believes to be wrong. You won't allow your brother, and that's the language he uses here in Romans 14, you won't allow your brother to be destroyed for the sake of food. All right? There's a lot of other things you can eat. Despite the fact that your conviction is it's okay to do this, there are times you need to act consistent with your brother's conviction. Not that you share his conviction, but your conduct is consistent with his conviction so that he can be at peace. And you can support him or her in the matter. All right, so alcohol is one. We still have convictions over differences of opinion over the Sabbath. The Westminster standards, to which all ministers in the ARP Church, all officers in the ARP Church are to subscribe, teach that the Lord's Day is a Sabbath day. that the observance of the Lord's Day, and the first day of the week, is to be kept as a Sabbath day, consistent with the fourth commandment. Now, there's at least one outstanding member of the Reformed tradition that doesn't believe that. John Calvin, of all people. John Calvin did not believe that we were obligated to observe the first day of the week, the Lord's Day, as the day of Christian worship. He believed that we are obligated to have a Christian day of worship. Calvin, living in a day when there is no separation of church and state, he's looking for a Christian commonwealth. He thinks it is the duty of the civil magistrates to appoint a day for it. It's their freedom to do so. We're not obligated to do it every 7 days. We can change that if we want. We're not obligated to do it on this day rather than another day, but it's worked for 1,000 years or more. There's no particular reason to change it. So the Lord's Day in Geneva was as strict as anything that you could hope for elsewhere. It wasn't as if they had football games going on down the street in Geneva on Sunday afternoons. But the biblical requirement on that. So John Calvin would have to take an exception to the Westminster Standards were he to apply for ordination in the ARP Church. And John Calvin could expect to face some, well, at least mildly aggressive challenge on the position. All right? And notably from myself on the matter. I happen to think that what Calvin wrote on the fourth commandment in the Institutes is far and away the worst thing that John Calvin ever wrote. I cannot imagine what made that seem so persuasive to him. All right? But who am I over against John Calvin? On that. You know, nobody would have taken me seriously in that. How do I even explain to myself how Calvin could have been so far off, if he is as far off as the Westminster divines would have thought he was? How could he get there? Well, in this way. In the Roman Catholic Church, they believed that the church had the authority to determine holy days and how they were observed. And they could require Christian businesses to shut down on holy days, according to the power of the church. And by the time of the 16th century Reformation, there were more holy days in the year than there were work days in the year. So part of the reason that the Protestant Reformation succeeds is that we had the support of the Chamber of Commerce. These people wanted to be open, to get out there and make money. All right, but they had too many obstacles from the church in this. So that's part of the reason we succeeded in capturing Western Europe during that time. The merchants got in line with us on this matter. So we didn't have near so many days where businesses had to shut down in the matter. Given all of that, all right, I think for Calvin, it just became a matter of seeing all of that as one piece. And he believed that the church had exceeded its authority in the matter, and that the regulation on the Sabbath day was a part of all the other holy days. It's like people today reading Colossians chapter 2. And Paul says, let no one be your judge regarding a new moon, a Sabbath day, or a festival. All right? My guess would be, if you hadn't had any prior teaching on this from me or anybody else, if we just read out Colossians chapter 2, and even after all the teaching with me, my guess would still be, a majority of this class would believe that Colossians chapter 2 meant that there was to be no required Sabbath day in the New Testament. That no one was to be your judge on the matter. That everybody was free to do that as they pleased on the Lord's Day. That Paul said clearly in Romans chapter 14 that one day is not more holy than another day. And my guess would be that the majority of Christian people, certainly it's evidenced by their practice, but the majority of conviction would be that on the basis of Colossians 2, Romans 14, and Galatians chapter 4, there is no New Testament basis for observing the Lord's Day as a Sabbath, of making it a moral obligation is what I mean. Not just, obviously we have to have some day for worship. And this has worked for now 2,000 years. It's as good a day as any other. All right, so why change it? If it's not broke, don't fix it. Uh, but the Westminster tradition believes that the Lord's Day is appointed by the new. Well, how could that be held consistent with this? Well, in this way. It's clear that in Romans chapter 14, Galatians chapter 4, and especially Colossians chapter 2, which actually uses the phrase Sabbath day, it's clear that what is in view is the Jewish Sabbath. It's the seventh day of the week that is at issue here. Or is there an obligation to observe the seventh day of the week? The answer is no. Why? Well, look what Paul says in Galatians 4, Romans 14, Colossians 2. We're not bound by the Jewish calendar. Well, then what's the obligation for observing the first day of the week? Well, admittedly, the evidence is not strong. But it was strong enough to overturn the Jewish calendar rather quickly, so that before the end of the first century, that day has a new name. It's called the Lord's Day. And it's quite clear from the fathers of the second century on, from Ignatius on, it was to be observed as a Sabbath day. Now, what would be the New Testament base? Well, as I said, the evidence isn't abundant, but you got to deal with this. All four of the Gospels go out of their way to stress the fact that the Lord's resurrection was on the first day of the week. They all stress that. John actually does it twice. That it was on that day, the first day of the week. Now, here's where I always get my Greek students in the seminary. When we get on this topic, I challenge them. I say, all right, now tell me, what is the Greek word for week? Oh, suddenly, they're utterly embarrassed. They're starting to rack. You know, they can see those flashcards going up in their mind where they've been learning their vocabulary. They carry them around. They pull them out at Starbucks. You see them everywhere, trying to learn their Greek vocabulary and so on. What, you know, it's a simple word. What is the Greek word for week? And they finally say, I don't know, I forgot that. I said, well, there's a very good reason why you don't know. I said, what's that? There is none. There is no Greek word for week. Not in the first century. Why not? It is, well, why is it in all our Bibles? Why does it talk about the first day of the week? Well, that's kind of how we talk today, and English translations do try to make it plain as to how you talk today. But there is no Greek word for week. It's the Jewish word Sabbath. It was the first day of the Sabbath. That's the name of the day for the Jews, because they didn't have names for the other days of the week. They had the Sabbath day. Then you have the first of the Sabbath, second of the Sabbath, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. Then you start all over again, you get the Sabbath day. All four Gospels emphasize that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was on the first of the Sabbath. And it becomes clear that that became a very special day within at least the Pauline churches. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul tells the Corinthian church that they need to lay aside their gifts on the first day of the week, on the first day of the Sabbath. They're to set aside this contribution that they're raising up for the church of Jerusalem. They're to do it on the first of the Sabbath. Why? It's not because they got paid every week. You see, the reason there's no New Testament word for week is that the solar week that would eventually become dominant in the Roman Empire isn't there yet. They're not standardly dividing time according to weeks. It's the Jews that do that. All right? They have weeks, which they call Sabbaths. They have groups of 7 days, and things repeat. But you don't have that standardly in the Roman Empire at this point. And yet Paul is telling Gentile Christians, both in Galatia and in Corinth, to lay aside their gifts on the first of the Sabbath. They're not paid on that day. All right? They're not standardly off on that day. How could that tie into their life? Well, Acts 27, Luke reports, it's in, again, Pauline territory, it's Paul's practice. He's in the city of Troas. And in Troas, he stayed there 7 days. And then he said, when we were gathered together on the first of the Sabbath to break bread. Paul stayed there 7 days, though we know from later in that same chapter he's in a hurry to get to Jerusalem. We know that Paul stayed there 7 days because he wanted to be there when the church met. He wanted to be there for their communion as we are celebrating today. When we were gathered together on the first day of the Sabbath for the breaking of bread. You see, that's when they did it. Here's Paul, the guy who is the author of Romans 14, Galatians 4, and Colossians 2, who told them nobody is to be their judge concerning a Sabbath day, a new moon, or a festival. Paul has apparently been instituting Gentile churches in the practice of gathering together on the first day of the Sabbath for the breaking of bread and for the preaching of the word. If you only had Romans 14, it'd be very reasonable to conclude that no day is any better than any other day. If you take in 1 Corinthians 16, Acts chapter 20, and particularly Revelation 1:10, you've got to come to a different conclusion, as the early church very quickly did. It was called the Lord's Day because it was the day on which the Lord rose. And the second century fathers tell you it was honored as a feast to commemorate the resurrection. You see, they had Easter every week, and it was that day. But we still have disagreements over that in the church. It's a mystery to me why people, even in the Reformed faith, cannot see things as clearly as I do. But I have to welcome those who are weak in faith. And it's standardly paraded almost every time we have an examination. Somebody will come through and say, well, I take the continental view on the Sabbath. I take an exception to this. Do you believe we have to worship every 7 days? Yeah. Do you believe it's on the first day of the week? We don't have a whole lot of evidence to go on. I think we've got plenty, but not everybody sees it that way. We got to live together in peace. The ARP Church will be somewhat tested on this. I'm not expecting a big problem on this. I think we might have some vociferous debate. I've mentioned before, a couple of years ago, we got a paper accompanying a memorial. A memorial is a request to the General Synod to act on a certain thing. And the memorial was arguing that the ordination of women to the office of deacons was contrary to the New Testament. All right, that's not been our practice. We allow the sessions of churches to decide the matter for themselves. But this paper was asking us to get rid of that toleration and insist on the fact that only men could be deacons. Now, this is not an issue upon which we have a lot of text to go on. Everybody has agreed that the word for deacon, diakonos in Greek, is in most all of its uses in the New Testament, simply to be translated as servant. In almost all its uses, it's a common word meaning servant. But you've got two places where it's a little bit more difficult. You have in the qualifications for women, for deacons, a verse dealing with women. And so the question is he talking about women deacons or is he talking about the wives of deacons? Because the same word, gunaikos, could mean either one. Which is it? It's hard to say. Then we have Romans chapter 16 that we'll get to in a minute. Phoebe is described as a diakonos, male, not a deaconess. It's a male word with a male ending in Greek. She's described as a deacon of the church at Cenchrea. She could be a servant of the church at Cenchrea. It's entirely possible that word normally means servant in almost all its other uses. The only place it doesn't for sure is Philippians 1:1 is addressed to the deacons at the church, and then 1 Timothy 3, verse 8 and 12 speaks of deacons in the church. Those are quite clearly offices, but almost every other use of the word just simply means a servant. But in those three places, it means an officer of the church. And in the middle of the qualifications dealing with deacons, you have the word for women or for wives. And some people have taken the position that this means the wives of the deacons. And some of us take the position it means the women who are deacons, as Phoebe was. Now, where's the area preach church going to go? Well, I think we're going to go where we have been. I happen to be on the committee. The guy that wrote the paper against it was on the committee. He's going to dissent from the committee's report. He's not going to file a minority report because his position's already out there. But he was recorded as voting against it. But our position is this. This is not a matter upon which we must agree in order to cooperate in a form of government. It does not affect the courts of our church. In the ARP church, the office of deacon does not bear authority. So if you have a belief that deacons have authority, that's not the ARP position. Okay? If you do believe that deacons have authority, then you've got to wrestle with 1 Timothy 2 that says Paul does not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man in the church. And so if you believe that authority belongs to the office of deacon, then you've got a problem with women deacons. But we, historically, do not believe that. We believe that deacons are an office of service. And so we have taken the position that this is a matter upon which churches can disagree. No church is forced to recognize the women deacons of another church. So we have women deacons in our church. All right, churches round about us who do not have women deacons, they are not forced to agree with our position on that. They can live their life in peace. And we'll live our life in peace. It doesn't have to be agreed upon by all. We don't have a lot of text to go on, okay? We got Romans 16, we got 1 Timothy 3. Then you got a few tangential issues that have to be resolved. But we only got 2 texts, all right? The idea that we might come to universal agreement on that is probably a little beyond our hope. But as it turns out, it's not something we need to agree on in order to cooperate in a form of government. No church is going to be forced to recognize the officers of another church that they don't agree with. And now I expect that position to prevail. But we'll see. We might have a good knockdown, drag-out fight for a while. But that'll go on for a while, and somebody will get tired of it, and somebody will get up and say, Mr. Moderator, I move the question. All right, and then we're going to have a vote on it, and I think the vote is going to come overwhelming here because the contrary vote is just going to be upending the life of the church for no good reason. Now, what we've actually argued, I say we, what the committee as majority has argued on this, that our position is actually consistent with the position of what's called the North American Presbyterian Reformed Council of Churches. That's NAPARC, that's the gathering of all people who are Reformed and kind of believe as we do in the Westminster Standards or in the 3 forms of unity of the continent. NAPARC has never raised an issue with us about our women deacons. NAPARC has never complained about the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America and its women deacons that they have had since 1888. Yes, 18 is correct. It wasn't 1988. It was 1888 that they adopted the position. And there's a French Reformed denomination. There's just 3 out of about 20 churches that belong to NAPARC. There's 3 of us that have women deacons, and the rest don't. NAPARC has never agonized over the fact that we're there. They've taken the position, it's okay for us to be weaker brothers. All right? And they're going to welcome us. All right? And if that's what they believe about us, that's fine. All right? We think we're the stronger brother, but we're not going to argue over that. We just go on with our life. And I would maintain this is actually the position of the Westminster Assembly itself. Now, that would be a real coup to say that this was Westminster doctrine, because what Westminster said about the office of deacon was simply that it's an ordinary, it is an office ordinary and perpetual in the church, that is given to the office to distribute to the needs of the poor, and that they are not to preach or administer the sacraments, which had been the medieval practice. So we've clearly identified the office of deacon as an office of service, while one committed to the ministry of mercy. It's not a clerical office, it doesn't bear ecclesiastical authority, and so on. But they didn't say anything about men or women. You say, wow, 17th century, who would have thought of that? Well, 1/2 of the Westminster Assembly thought of it. When they swept away all the episcopal hierarchy, they made a list of all the possible offices there were in the New Testament. And they ran them down the list, from apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, and so on, ruling elders, etc., on down the list. And they had widows listed among the possible offices in the New Testament from 1 Timothy 5. And they had a rip-roaring debate over the question of whether the widows of 1 Timothy 5 were deacons of 1 Timothy 3. Now, we only know this because of John Lightfoot's journal, because the minutes of the Westminster Assembly for that period of time have evaporated into thin air. But Lightfoot carried a journal through that period of time. He recorded their debates and so on. And this one in particular he recorded because he disagreed with the action. The assembly voted on the question of whether there would be women deacons who were the widows. It split down the middle, but for one vote. And Lightfoot lamented it because he got called away to business in the city of London that day, and he wasn't there for the vote. Had he been there, they would have tied dead even. Well, there's typically about 60 to 80 people sitting at the Westminster Assembly on any given day. So I'm got 33 to 32, something like that. It actually passed. It actually won. But when the final draft was set before the assembly to vote, nothing was said about the women, despite the fact that it effectively overturned a previous decision of the assembly. Nothing was said about it. Why not? Well, perhaps for this reason. On the next day, they had a debate about Phoebe. But in Phoebe's case, the debate was she both a widow and a deacon? And that failed, which I think it should have, because I don't think there was any good reason to believe she was necessarily a widow. She might have been, but anyway, that failed. When it finally came to the time for the report, I think they just said, let's let this go. We don't need to go there. This is not something we need to agree on to unite this kingdom together. We'll just let it pass. I think it's a reasonable decision. Now, as I said, I personally believe that the better part of the evidence is in favor of women deacons. I don't think there's any good reason at all to think that the wives of 1 Timothy 3 are in view here. If they are, it would mean that the practice of the church has been very odd for a long period of time, because when we elect men to be deacons, we do not examine their wives. But Paul was clearly giving qualifications for those women, whoever they are, in the midst of qualifications for deacons, which I think makes the most sense, that these are women deacons. And the argument, and this is everybody's argument on it, the argument as to why the wives of deacons would have been, is that the office of deacon necessarily involves caring for the needs of the poor. And there'd be certain situations where it was inappropriate for a man to be caring for the bodily needs of a woman. And so the wives had to be put into it. Well, isn't that an interesting position? That they're qualified to do the work of deacons, but they're not qualified to bear the name of deacons? Isn't that an odd position to take? I know you women don't think that's very odd. That's been going on for millennia. You've always done all the work of the church without the honor paid to it. But I happen to believe that the reason those qualifications are there is because they served in the office of the deacons. They didn't just share in the duties of the deacons. They were in the office. And I think Phoebe was one. And that's why she's called not just a servant of the Lord Jesus Christ, but a deacon of the church at Cenchreae. Will I be welcomed as a weakened brother at the... Well, I think we've got the majority on this. But this is a matter upon which Christians could have vigorous debate and different opinions. And like the holy days or the food, Romans chapter 14, we ought to be able to live together with those kinds of disagreements. The idea that we're going to agree on every point of orthodoxy between here and heaven is rather unrealistic, inasmuch as we've gone 2,000 years without getting very close to that. All right? It shouldn't be hard to imagine it could go another 2,000 years, and the Baptists and the Presbyterians won't work out the doctrine of baptism. All right? But we ought to be able to live together in the Church of Christ. And I think that's what Paul says. I don't have time for it. We're out of time. We'll pick up. Let's pray. Father, we pray that you will enable us to live together and welcome one another together in the body of Christ. That the unity of your church would not be broken for a failure of love or for a point of pride, but rather we would seek to serve one another and build one another up in Christ, that we may labor together for his honor and glory. And we ask it in his name. Amen.